start a little bit with how it is that a clinical psychologist ends up giving the closing remarks here on a military-industrial complex. And actually, I've been fighting against, writing about, speaking about another industrial complex for lots of years now, and it's the pharmaceutical industrial complex, specifically the psychopharmaceutical industrial complex. And actually, all these complexes, what I found are sort of sadly, boringly, painfully the same. All of these revolving doors of employment. So, for example, if the National Institute of Mental Health, which is a government agency a major government agency that funds researchers. If you've been friendly to drug companies, if you're a researcher, you get rewarded, or if you're an executive at the NIMH, you get a job with drug companies. This is very similar stuff. The pharmaceutical companies fund just about every major mental health institution anybody here has ever heard of, from the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, which is a consumer group, to the American Psychiatric Association, which is the professional organization of America's psychiatrists. And actually, the American Psychiatric Association, they are the ones responsible for creating the diagnostic manual, something called the DSM. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of. Right now, they're up to the DSM-4. Each one of these DSM get bigger and bigger. They're working on the DSM-5 as we speak. And I know a lot of folks here have seen the Eugene Jarecki movie, Why We Fight. And in it, Chalmers Johnson says, I guarantee you, when war becomes that profitable, you're going to see a lot more of it. And the same thing has been really true for mental illness. And so, like a lot of other people here, a lot of other speakers, my sort of activism really starts with embarrassment. And it starts with embarrassment of my own profession and moves into other kinds of embarrassments and anger. Okay, we can talk a little bit about that too. I'm one of those folks that sees a big difference between anger and violence. I'm very much opposed to violence and hate, but that's different than anger, okay?
Right.
And so, you know, one of the things that I became initially embarrassed by my own profession was that you're pathologizing normal human behavior to make a buck. So, I mean, some of the stuff, it sounds silly and funny, but a lot of it's not, as we'll see. But they started to, you know, call more and more shy people, avoidant personality, and moody, temper tantrum 2-year-olds are now pediatric bipolar disorder, all receiving heavy-duty drugs. But beyond this simple embarrassment, I started to really get upset when that DSM-3 came out and they started to pathologize rebellion, basically. Started to pathologize anti-authoritarianism and resistance, especially among young people. So, and one of the most obvious ones of this is, and I remember when it first came out, I said to my colleagues, I said, "You got to be kidding! This has got to be a joke." And this was a mental illness called oppositional defiant disorder. ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. The symptoms of oppositional defiant disorder include often refusing to comply with adults' requests and rules. Okay, and angry with adults, irritated by adults. And, you know, certainly I've worked with a lot of these young people for a lot of my life, and, you know, they can be a handful sometimes for some parents, okay? But they're also the hope of the nation. Yeah. All right? If we take a look, which I've done, at the history of activism in America, from Tom Paine to Saul Alinsky to, you know, to lots of other, Malcolm X, you could just list Emma Goldman, almost all of them would have been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. So I became more than embarrassed, I became scared that now my profession was becoming one more sort of spoke in the wheel that was pacifying Americans. And there are other spokes too that we'll talk a little bit about them later. And I should say, I'll maybe say this more than once, is that when I talk about these things, it's not to depress us, but it's to realize that there are a lot of democracy battlefields. Not just national elections, not just demonstrations, lots of democracy battlefields to get back our strength, okay? And so, anyways, another area that I've had a lot of interest in for a lot of years is depression. It used to be called melancholia, just the whole idea that you become so overwhelmed by the pains of your life that you move into just shutting down, just becoming depressed. And a previous book, prior to the one that some of you have seen out there in the lobby, there was a book about depression, and I talked about a lot of the different political, cultural, and social reasons why in America today we have a tenfold increase in depression compared to 50 years ago. Why is it that 10% of Americans are now on some kind of antidepressant drug? Why is it that the World Health Organization predicted by 2020 depression is going to be the second leading illness in the world? I mean, there's definitely some political, cultural, social reasons around here. It's not like Al-Qaeda sucked the serotonin out of us here. You know, and for that, I should tell you, it does not take very much in America to be labeled as a dissident psychologist. And you just heard what it takes. Okay? Not much. And so, these interests, as I thought a lot about depressed individuals, and this leads me more directly to how I end up at this conference, okay, is I started to think a lot more about how we become politically pacified, and that there were parallels to sort of individual depression, that what happens is when you really understand how depression works is you just get so overwhelmed by your pain that you can't feel it anymore and you just kind of shut down. And this happens to a lot of people in terms of how they're pacified. And I really started thinking about this whole idea of how Americans were increasingly politically pacified at sort of the end of around the end of 2009. And I was looking back at the decade, looking back at senseless wars, loss of economic, justice, social justice, on, and how really compared to other kinds of events in American history, compared certainly to the rest of the world, how really passive we were. And I had questions about that. How the heck did that happen? What was going on about this? So what I decided to do at the end of 2009 was to write some articles about this in places that would publish a guy like me, which is not the New York Times. So I get published in places like Z Magazine and Alternet and Counterpunch and Truth Out. Those are the kind of places that'll publish a guy like me. And what I was interested in writing these articles in those places was, were other people seeing this increasing pacifying of Americans? And started to talk about some of the reasons for that, but most importantly, like what the heck we can do to transform that. So that's what I care a lot about. And it was really interesting. I got this overwhelming reaction to these articles. I talked a lot. I started to talk about some of the psychological reasons for them. Some of the ideas of just like you move into a kind of learned helplessness, that you move into after a certain amount of, if you only focus on the democracy battlefield of elections, national elections, and you vote for a Republican or a Democrat, you still get senseless wars and corporate control. You move into a kind of helplessness there. I talked about some of the stuff about how I worked with people in abuse syndromes for over 25 years. Okay, and just the simple reality is when you eat crap for a little too long, whether it's emotional abuse, physical abuse, or whatever, you get weak, okay? It's just what happens. And there's a certain dynamic that goes on with how you kind of help people to get out of that. And so I speculated on a lot of these things in these initial articles. Well, like I said, I got this overwhelming reaction across the political spectrum to this, to almost more than anything that I'd ever written. I got one of the direct reasons why I'm here today is one of those response articles that I've got. I got lots of emails, lots of personal comments, and response articles people were writing. One was from David Swanson. So that's how I met this guy. And he had, and it was exactly, actually I should say for a second, his piece was exactly what I was looking for. It was like other ideas about what's going on here, what we might do to help transform this. So that's what I was looking for. I also got, I should tell folks, a lot of folks have been talking about how do we build bridges, how do we build a larger base. I got a lot of response from the sort of libertarian world, okay, on this. And people in the audience here, a lot of us know it, maybe all of us don't, is that there's a big difference between Tea Partiers, okay, who are bigots and militarists, okay, versus the libertarian, anti-war, anti-corporate bailout, anti-corporate welfare world. Okay, we should keep that in mind. And those people, I dialogue with. They'd invite me on their radio shows. They'd like me. I don't know exactly why they like me. I try to analyze this. Maybe part of it is that they're a lot more comfortable with anger than a lot more people on the left and liberals. And they were surprised that they could feel I got some anger. And they kind of like that. They also like the fact that, that I was talking about this issue of passivity. And they noticed a lot of, that there weren't too many folks on the left talking about that. They talk about that all the time if you go listen to these libertarian talk shows. And the interesting thing is once you create a certain kind of understanding, I get on their shows and I talk to them about about, about things that were problematic, that we did disagree on. Then you can get into other issues of like healthcare, where there are disagreements. And so, but that's one of the things that I've learned, that there's a whole huge group, and we'll talk about some others here in terms of, to use Jonathan's phrase here, base building. But that's a world that we can't connect with, and there's ways to do that. That was, so as I wrote these articles, I got this huge response from it. I decided that I'd already wanted to write a book on this topic to get into much more detail about what the heck was causing it, and more importantly, which I couldn't do in these articles, how the heck we can transform it. It felt to me that was the fundamental issue of my mind. How do we transform this passivity? And some of the things that I had seen, I should tell you, over the last decade that really made me start to think about this passivity was one of the first things at the end of 2009 was this, just taking a look at one issue, just the issue of disputed presidential elections, okay? And I remember, this was before the Arab Spring, at the end of 2009, I remember seeing it in Iran, that after their disputed presidential election, 2 million people hit the streets in Tehran there. They were told they were going to get shot at. They did get shot at. Some people got killed. It didn't stop them. Mexico, 2006, the more progressive guy is defeated there in a disputed election. People get out, 2-3 million people on the streets. They surround embassies, surround banks. 2004, okay, some people might have forgotten the Ukraine Orange Revolution. I see some head shakes. The more progressive guy gets defeated initially. Not only are there people demonstrating on the streets, they shut down the country, basically, to the point where the Ukrainian Supreme Court has to call for new elections. And actually the Orange Revolution succeeds. The more progressive guy, Yushchenko, wins. And so then I thought about our disputed presidential election in 2000. Remember? The one that indisputably Al Gore had 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush. Now, again, I'm not this big Al Gore fan, all right? But this was like over 50 million people voted for this guy, and he won by 500,000 more votes. And there's this recount going on in Florida for the whole electoral college deal, right? And the U.S. Supreme Court comes in there, and they stop the recount in December of 2000, and they hand the election over to George W. Bush. And I'm going like, whoa, what is the American people going to do? But it gets even more interesting. You may remember at the time, and this was widely published, New York Times, Washington Post, one of the dissenting justices, John Paul Stevens, no radical. I mean, this guy was appointed by Gerald Ford. Okay, but he's so disgusted with his fellow Supreme Court justices, he says something like this, is pretty close to it. He says, we'll never really know the winner of this year's presidential election, but the loser is clear. It's the nation's confidence in the judge as the impartial guardian in the rule of law. Well, not much. And when the Supreme Court made that decision in December that year, there was a handful of people protesting. And at Bush's inauguration, there were people, 50, 60,000 maybe, who were really pissed off at Bush. They were there, but nobody was disputing this election, not like it went on in these other countries. And I remember thinking at the time, if I was Bush and Cheney, one of the lessons that I would have learned is we can get away with just about anything. And that seems to be the lesson that they learned. So, and of course there are other areas that really were striking for me, very remarkable for me, was the war issue. Was that a lot of people don't remember, not in this group, but in the American public, is that as these wars have become actually more unpopular in the polls, there's actually been less resistance. Okay, so even in the Afghanistan war, when we first went in there, when 80–90% of American people, we were told this is all about getting bin Laden, and most American people bought that, and they were for this war. And if you go back, and even September that year, they went in October of 2001, in September, late September, 20,000 people protested in Washington, D.C. You know how remarkable it would be to get 20,000 people today? And of course, more people remember in Iraq, when we were going to go in February of 2003, everybody knew about it. If you looked at the polls, the majority of the American people still supported that war. They bought the WMDs and a lot of the other lies. But even with that, you had 500,000 people in New York City, big protests all over America. I should say larger protests in Europe, right? London had the largest protest ever of any kind against anything, okay, at that point. Bigger protests in Spain, Italy, all over. And the remarkable thing for me was as these wars, as you saw the poll numbers change, and nowadays, depending on how the questions are asked, or whether it's at least 60–65% oppose these wars, sometimes higher, you see less resistance. So this seemed to me like this compelling thing. It's like, what the heck happened? What was going on? So I decided to spend all of 2010 thinking about this, thinking about what were the causes for this American political passivity, and more importantly, what the heck we could do about it, how we can transform that. And one of the first things that I did when I was researching this book was I thought, how I really want to get into not just the strategies and tactics of previous democratic movements. I want to get into what was the psyche of people, okay? What was going on in their heads in these great democratic movements in world history, or mostly American history. And when you get into that kind of research, it doesn't take very long for you to run across the name of Lawrence Goodwin. Okay, a lot of people who are historians would know this person. He was actually a journalist for a while, and he studied democratic movements, wrote a book on solidarity, but most famous among historians for his work on the populist movement, which is the great agrarian, the farmers' revolt in the 1880s, 1890s against the crop-lien system. They're all losing their homes to the money-to-lead of that era. The banks are always in the money-to-lead, but the railroads were in, and also the exploitative furnishing merchants. And so there's a lot of great lessons, strategies, and tactics of what those guys did in the populist movement. And I talk a lot about them in my work, but for now, I just want to stick with the interesting observation for me that Goodwin comes to was that when he takes a look at all these democratic movements, he comes to the conclusion that there's two cultural and psychological building blocks that people had when they were to create these successful movements. And they are individual self-respect and collective self-confidence. Now, by that he meant, by individual self-respect, he meant people in these movements, these populists, a lot of them were dirt poor farmers with very little schooling, okay? But they had individual self-respect. They didn't accept their bequeathed role, this is his quote, their bequeathed role in the social hierarchy. In other words, just because they didn't have 2 PhDs or they weren't millionaires, they didn't view themselves as inferior. They didn't view themselves as a mere subject to power. So that's really critical. The other thing was this thing of collective self-confidence. Very simply, it just means your belief that you can actually win. Your belief that you can actually overcome your oppressors. And so it became clear to me that these were two huge things that had been lost in America in a lot of different ways. And there are other important variables, I think, that a lot of folks who are, social scientists, like in my world, don't talk enough about anything that you really can't quantify and measure. I guess you can't do a dissertation on it, so it's not talked about enough. But for great democratic movements, they always require things like guts, courage, kahunas, whatever you want to call them. They're always there. It always requires determination. It always requires solidarity. These are important, all right? Another thing that I think about a lot, which ended up being the title, I guess David gave the title to this thing, of my talk was about anti-authoritarianism. And that becomes, for me, a huge variable, too, in a lot of different ways. Now, I should define that. I mean, really, what authoritarianism itself, authoritarianism just simply means an unquestioning obedience to authority. That's what authoritarianism is. Anti-authoritarianism means that you question an authority. You question whether that authority is legitimate or not legitimate. Does that authority know what it's talking about or not? Does that authority lie or tell the truth? Does that authority actually care about the people who are taking it seriously? Or is this authority on some kind of a financial or ego trip? Then, if you assess that authority to be illegitimate, not legitimate, you challenge that authority. You resist that authority. That's essential to democracy. If that process is not going on, you're not going to have democracy. So the important thing about anti-authoritarianism is, of course, it's important intellectually, but it's also important in terms of creating a certain energy. And when you lose that in your culture and your society, you lose a certain important energy for democratic movement. So, you know, for example, there's lots of historical examples. Of one of the guys I like to think about a lot is, as opposed to a lot of the elitists and aristocrats who were part of the founding fathers, one of my favorite guys is Tom Paine, who's not. He's a working class guy who comes over to America in 1774. And he is intoxicated by this country's anti-authoritarianism. He gauges correctly that the anti-authoritarianism of the people is far more than a lot of these future founding fathers. George Washington is still toasting King George in 1775. All they're really rebelling against is Parliament. Parliament's taxation without representation, right? We've heard that enough. But Tom Paine goes, I've been there. They're all illegitimate authorities. To heck with Parliament, to heck with King George, to heck with the British East India Corporation, to heck with all of them. And he utters the taboo word of independence. This is taboo when he writes Common Sense in January 1776. This pamphlet ends up selling, it gets read by 500,000 out of 3 million colonials. Which is, what's that, like 50 million would be the equivalent today. And Jefferson, 6 months later, goes, oh, wow, there's a market share for this Declaration of Independence. He really, in some ways, paves the way, all right? And so this anti-authoritarianism is also hugely important in terms of creating real solidarity, okay? How you create real solidarity is you see somebody out there challenging some illegitimate authority, okay? And you support it. You support it in the flesh. You support it in all different ways. And that's how you build those strong bonds that you need when push comes to shove, which it always will, because power strikes back, right? So this becomes a really important thing. So I thought what I spent a lot of time thinking about is how, besides the spoke in the wheel of my own embarrassing profession, what are the other spokes out there that are breaking people's individual self-respect, their collective self-confidence, their anti-authoritarianism, their determination, their courage, and their solidarity. What the heck is doing it out there? And, what's it? TSA, that's one. That's one. We can talk about that. Well, we'll start with that. You read that, but no more into it. You know, one of them is surveillance. I mean, that's a huge one out there. And one of the things that's interesting for me with that one, and she brought, that's one of my 12 spokes in the wheel, is that when I talk, another one, by the way, is the decimation of labor unions. And so when I talk on these libertarian radio stations, they have huge passion about surveillance, okay? But what do? They focus only on government surveillance, which is big. That's really important. But the reality is, what creates most sort of fear that's breaking people is, and I see people know where I'm going, is workplace surveillance. That's what's causing most of people's fear. That's what most people, unlike this group here, you're worried about the government checking your email. But most of America is worried about, you know, those cameras in their warehouses so they can't even sit down for a minute, okay? Or about their company when they take their laptop to recheck it, or they're going to be looking at what you've done for the last month. And so when I talked to these libertarian folks, I said, I know you guys are not crazy about unions, but in America, it's legal for these guys to do that, unless you have a union. That's going to protect you from that kind of surveillance. And all of a sudden, not that I get all of them to agree with me, but it's an interesting way of creating a dialogue to start thinking about some things differently. A lot of different things that are breaking Americans' kind of spirit of social isolation. I'm not going to go through them all, but that's a really compelling one. Right now in America today, 25% of Americans do not have a single confidant in their lives. Nobody that they can talk to the most important things. This is up from 10% in just about 25 years ago. All right? And this was actually done in a really, really well-done study I talked about in my book and stuff. And so there's a lot of different things. Of course, all of these things, from surveillance to social isolation to loss of kind of union strength, these create fear, okay? And fear breaks folks. And so a lot of what we're talking about is how do we overcome fear? And so again, there's these democracy battlefields in all aspects of our life to kind of let go of fear. But we got to see what's doing it, what's doing us in.